The human mind is a fragile, elastic thing, capable of stretching over immense trauma until it snaps back into a shape you no longer recognize. If you look at a clock right now, you take for granted that the ticking second hand moves with absolute certainty. 1 second follows the next. But out there, in the deep, choked throat of the Blackwood Ridge, time doesn't tick. It bleeds. My name is Julian. I used to laugh at people who claimed they were swallowed by the wilderness. I used to think the woods were just trees, soil, and apex predators with fur and claws. I didn't know about the gaps. I didn't know about the things that crawl inside the silence when the world forgets you exist. It started with a solo camping trip, a desperate bid to escape the crushing digital static of my ordinary life. I wanted isolation. I wanted absolute quiet. God help me, I got exactly what I asked for. The drive out to the trailhead took 6 hours, winding deeper into a landscape that felt progressively discarded by civilization. The radio station faded out around hour 3, dissolving into a low, rhythmic hum of white noise that somehow sounded like a choir of muffled voices whispering just beneath the static. I should have turned back then. The air grew heavy, smelling faintly of old copper and wet ash. I parked my truck at the dead end of a logging road that hadn't seen tires in a decade. The rusty sign planted by the Forestry Service didn't say no trespassing. It simply read, "Beyond this point, communication cannot be guaranteed." I hoisted my internal frame pack, adjusted the nylon straps across my chest, and stepped past the rotting timber line. The canopy closed above my head like a heavy, green vault, instantly choking out the afternoon sun. I hiked for 5 hours straight, guided only by an outdated topographic map and the fading blazes carved into the ancient bark of hemlock trees. The silence of the Blackwood Ridge wasn't a peaceful absence of noise, it was an active, heavy pressure. There were no birds. No squirrels chattering in the brush. No wind rustling the high leaves. The forest felt like a painted backdrop, frozen in a state of perpetual, anxious anticipation. My boots sank deep into the damp peat, each step making a wet, sucking sound that felt inappropriately loud in the dead air. By the time the shadows began to stretch and warp between the thick trunks, I found the clearing. It was a perfect, unnatural circle of dead grass, surrounded by trees that curved away from the center as if they were trying to flee the very ground they were rooted in. I set up my high-end dual-layer nylon tent right in the center of that bizarre clearing. I was too exhausted to care about the strange geometry of the trees. My hands were shaking slightly from the exertion, the cold mountain air biting at my knuckles as I hammered the aluminum stakes into the unusually soft earth. The soil was pitch black, almost greasy to the touch, and it gave off a faint, sweet odor of decay that clung to the back of my throat. I tried to swallow, but my mouth felt dry, coated in a strange metallic film. To shake off the mounting unease, I lit my small portable camping stove. The bright blue hiss of the butane flame was a fragile shield against the creeping dark, but as the sun dropped fully behind the jagged ridge, the flame began to sputter and flicker, casting long, frantic shadows across the nylon walls of my shelter. Night in the Blackwood Ridge doesn't fall, it suffocates. The darkness was absolute, thick enough to feel like a physical weight pressing against the fabric of my tent. I crawled into my thermal sleeping bag, zipping it up to my chin, desperately trying to convince myself that the tight, suffocating feeling in my chest was just mild altitude sickness. I pulled out my phone to check the time. The screen illuminated the small tent with a harsh, sterile glow. 9:14 p.m. No service, of course, but the battery icon was doing something impossible. The percentage was rapidly ticking down, descending from 80% to 40, then 20, then 5, before the screen violently flickered with green horizontal lines and died completely. I slammed the phone down onto the sleeping pad. The darkness rushed back in, thicker than before. That was when the scratching started. It wasn't the clumsy, erratic scuffle of a raccoon or a stray possum digging for food scraps. It was deliberate. A single, sharp point dragging slowly along the exterior nylon of the tent's back wall. Scratch, scratch. It moved from left to right, perfectly horizontal, maintaining an even, agonizingly slow pace. I froze, my breath catching in my throat, every muscle in my body locking down into an agonizing cramp. The sound was so close I could hear the microscopic fibers of the fabric fraying under the pressure. I tried to tell myself it was a branches catching the wind, but there was no wind. The air outside was dead. The scratching reached the corner of the tent, paused for 3 long agonizing heartbeats, and then began to move up the vertical seam toward the roof. "Who's out there?" I yelled, but the sound that came out of my throat was pathetic, cracked and reeking of raw terror. The scratching stopped instantly. The silence that followed was so profound I could hear the frantic, wet thumping of my own heart against my ribs. I stared up at the apex of the tent, my eyes straining against the pitch black, waiting for the fabric to rip open, waiting for a pale hand or a nameless face to press through the nylon. Minutes stretched into absolute eternities. Nothing moved. Then a low vibration started in the ground beneath my sleeping pad. It wasn't an earthquake. It felt like a hum, a deep, rhythmic frequency that vibrated right through my skull, mimicking the exact pattern of the white noise radio static from my drive. My eyelids grew impossibly heavy. I tried to fight it, tried to reach for my hunting knife, but my limbs felt like poured concrete. When I opened my eyes, the world was wrong. The air inside the tent was freezing, my breath pluming into thick, gray clouds that hung suspended in the space above me. I looked down at my hands. They were covered in deep, purple bruising beneath the skin, as if all the capillaries had ruptured simultaneously. I frantically reached for my dead phone, but it wasn't on the pad. I scrambled toward the tent zipper, my fingers fumbling blindly with the cold metal tabs. I threw the flap open and stumbled out into the daylight. But it wasn't the forest I had fallen asleep in. The circular clearing was gone. My tent was perched precariously on the edge of a massive, jagged sinkhole that hadn't been there the night before. The trees surrounding the pit were blackened, their bark stripped away to reveal pale, glistening wood that looked like exposed muscle tissue. I checked my wrist watch, the mechanical kind that doesn't rely on a battery. The hands were spinning erratically, the gears inside whirring with a terrifying loose velocity. I felt a sudden violent wave of nausea hit me. I fell to my knees, vomiting black, watery bile onto the white wood of a fallen tree. My stomach convulsed painfully, and as I wiped my mouth, my fingers brushed against my neck. There was something hard beneath the skin behind my left ear. A solid, oval lump about the size of a coin, completely numb to the touch but throbbing with a faint, internal heat. Panic, cold and sharp, flooded my system. I looked around wildly, trying to find the trail I had hiked in on, but the landscape had shifted completely. The ridges were in the wrong places. The sun was directly overhead, but it cast no shadows. I left everything behind, my pack, my stove, my shelter. I ran. I scrambled through the thick, choking undergrowth, my clothes tearing on thorns that felt sharper than surgical steel. The forest seemed to stretch infinitely in every direction, looping back on itself with a sickening, labyrinthine logic. Every time I thought I was heading south toward the logging road, I would find myself standing right back at the edge of another massive, yawning sinkhole. The air grew progressively warmer, smelling intensely of ozone and copper. I ran until my lungs felt like they were filled with crushed glass, my feet blistering inside my heavy boots. And then I saw the cabin. It was a collapsed timber structure, half swallowed by the creeping roots of a massive ancient oak tree that looked older than the mountain itself. The door of the cabin was hanging off its rusty hinges, creaking softly despite the absolute lack of wind. I stepped inside, desperate for any semblance of human shelter, but the interior was a nightmare of abandoned time. A thick layer of gray dust covered everything, but in the center of the rotting floorboards, there was a clear space. Someone had dragged a heavy wooden chair into the middle of the room. Tied to the armrests were thick, frayed nylon ropes, severed cleanly as if by a frantic blade. I approached the chair, my heart hammering in my dry throat. On the floor beneath the seat lay a scattering of Polaroid photographs. I knelt down, my trembling hand reaching out to flip the first one over. The photograph was a close-up of a human face. It was me. But my eyes were wide, completely bloodshot, the pupils dilated to the very edges of the iris until there was no color left. I looked completely feral, my jaw locked open in a silent, agonizing scream. I flipped the next photo over. It showed the back of my head, and there was a deep vertical incision behind my left ear, held open by crude metal retractors while a pale, thin finger reached into the wound. The background of the photo was pitch black, lit only by a harsh, artificial flash. I dropped the pictures, screaming, backing away from the chair until my spine slammed into the rotting log wall of the cabin. "You shouldn't be looking at those," a voice whispered from the darkness of the cabin's collapsed cellar. I whirled around, my hand flying to the hunting knife at my belt. A man crawled out from the shadows beneath the floorboards. He was gaunt, his skin a translucent, sickly gray, clad in rags that looked like the remnants of a forestry uniform from decades ago. His left eye was completely milky white, cataracts clouding his vision, but his right eye was wide, clear, and burning with a frantic, desperate lucidity. His fingers were missing the nails, the raw flesh of his fingertips long since healed into hard, smooth mounds of scar tissue. "Who are you?" I screamed, my voice echoing off the decaying timbers. The man didn't answer directly. He shambled closer, his joints popping loudly with every heavy step. "My name was Marcus," he croaked, his vocal cords sounding like dry leather scraping together. "I was the caretaker here, before the loop took me." "You've been gone a long time, Julian." I froze, the knife shaking in my grip. "How do you know my name?" "I just got here yesterday." Marcus let out a dry, rattling laugh that turned into a violent coughing fit. "Yesterday? Check your skin, boy. Look at the shadows that aren't there. You didn't sleep for one night. You've been in the pit for 4 whole days. They just put you back." The words hit me like a physical blow, making my head swim with a sudden, violent vertigo. 4 days. It wasn't possible. I remembered the scratching on the tent wall. I remembered the low, vibrating hum. But between that sound and waking up by the sinkhole, there was nothing. A vast, black void in my memory that refused to yield a single image. What did they do to me? I begged, dropping the knife, my resolve completely shattering. Marcus stepped into a shaft of pale light filtering through the roof. He reached up and pulled back his own left ear. There was a jagged, raised purple scar running vertically down his neck, the exact location of the throbbing lump beneath my own skin. "They plant the seed," Marcus whispered. "They use our time to feed the things that crawl beneath the ridge. And when the 4 days are up, the static comes back to claim the rest." As if on cue, the low, vibrating hum returned, shaking the rotting floorboards of the cabin with a violent, terrifying intensity. The dust on the ground began to dance and leap into the air, forming strange, geometric patterns that mirrored the unnatural alignment of the trees outside. The air inside the room turned a deep, bruised shade of purple, and the metallic smell of copper became so thick I could taste it on the back of my tongue. Marcus fell to his knees, his hands clawing at his ears as his nose began to bleed a dark, thick fluid that looked exactly like the bile I had vomited earlier. "They're coming back for the harvest," he screamed over the mounting noise. "The loop is closing, Julian. If you don't run into the dark right now, you'll never leave these woods." Through the open doorway of the cabin, the forest began to dissolve. The pale, stripped trees were warping, twisting into impossible angles as a thick, gray static, like the snow on an old television set, began to pour over the ridge, erasing the landscape wave by wave. Within that static, I could see the silhouettes of things that were too tall, their limbs moving with a disjointed, mechanical rhythm, their long, thin fingers reaching out toward the structure. Marcus screamed one last time before the gray static slammed into him, his body instantly dissolving into a cloud of pale dust that vanished into the air. The static roared at the threshold of the door, inches from my face. I backed away toward the rear window, my heart leaping into my throat, knowing that one step back meant falling into the unknown dark.